Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. We are on the Human Reproductive System, Chapter 23, Part 4, and we are on the Female Reproductive System, and we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle. There are a lot of cyclical changes in the menstrual cycle. So the average menstrual cycle is 28 days, but it could be quite different than that. Normal would be considered anywhere between 21 and 35 days. And it is a complex interplay between hormones and different organs at the level of the brain, at the level of the ovaries, and at the level of the uterus. And we're going to be jumping into this just now. Here is a mnemonic to help you remember what's going on. F, it's going to spell philo, like a fallopian tube, like a uterine tube. F stands for FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. E stands for estrogen. L stands for luteinizing hormone. O stands for ovulation. And P stands for progesterone. So keep that in mind, and we're going to come back to those letters soon. Okay, so the hormones involved, let's take a look at where they're coming from. Pituitary hormones are FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. And these are coming from the pituitary gland in the brain. And as you can see, in mid-cycle, there is a surge of both of them. Then some of the hormones are coming from the ovaries. These are the ovarian hormones, the estrogen and the progesterone. As you can see, there's also ups and downs of the estrogen and the progesterone. My dog Anya was interested to see what we were talking about. She is female, but she does not have a menstrual cycle. She has a estrous cycle, which is different. Okay, as you can see, she already lost interest. Good thing you have a longer attention span than a dog. Let's talk about what's going on in the ovaries. In the ovarian cycle has three phases: the follicular phase, the ovulation, and the luteal phase. Talking first about the follicular phase, this is the first 14 days, and this phase can be quite variable. Anywhere from 7 to 21 would be considered normal. And during this phase, the ovum develops in a follicle in the ovary. And it is stimulated by FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, coming from the anterior pituitary of the brain. Looking here, you have a follicle that is developing, and then this shows more than the follicular phase. This shows ovulation, and then the luteal phase also. So once the follicle is developing, it produces the hormone estrogen. And once we get the signal from the brain, the ovum is released from the follicle, and this is caused by the LH surge from the pituitary gland. And then the ovum is picked up by the fimbriae of the uterine tubes. So as we can see here, this was the follicular phase, and then when that LH surge happened, there was ovulation, and it actually bursts through the ovary wall. After ovulation, we have moved on to the luteal phase, and this is post-ovulatory, after ovulation phase, and it lasts 14 days, and this is quite a bit more regulated than the follicular phase. So it could be anywhere between 10 to 16 days, but it is usually very consistent from cycle to cycle. And if you have a post-ovulatory phase that lasts 18 days, then you are pregnant. So the corpus luteum develops from the exploded follicle, and it is going to be producing progesterone and estrogen. And that's going to be important later. So we have our ovulation, and then the follicle we now call a corpus luteum, and it is producing hormones of its own, like I said, progesterone and estrogen. So the progesterone stimulates the uterus to be ready for a fertilized egg, And then after about 14 days, if there is no pregnancy, the corpus luteum disintegrates, and that will make another cycle start again. So the uterine cycle, let's talk about what's going on in the uterus as all of these things are happening in the ovary. First off is the menstrual phase, and this will last from day 1. Whenever menses or menstruation starts, we always call that day 1 of a new cycle, and it will last until day 5, 6, 7, however long the menstruation lasts. And during this phase, the lower estrogen and progesterone levels causes the endometrium layer of the uterus to degenerate, and it leaves the body through the vagina as menstrual fluid. And so we know that the corpus luteum in the ovary was producing estrogen and progesterone, and so when that disintegrated and stopped producing estrogen and progesterone, then the endometrium in the uterus gets the signal to exit the body. Okay, next up, proliferative phase. That's from whenever the menstrual phase ends to around day 14, and the endometrium is rebuilding itself. So basically, as soon as it's gone, it starts rebuilding itself up again. And then from day 14-ish to the end of the cycle is the secretory phase, and the endometrium continues to rebuild itself. So let's take a look at what's going on in the uterine cycles. So we have the menstrual phase here, and that is when the endometrium layer is degenerating and leaving the body. As you can see up in the ovaries, we are in the follicular phase, and that lasts for the menstrual phase in the uterus and the proliferative phase in the uterus, where the endometrium is rebuilding itself. And then in the ovary, when the ovulation occurs, then we move into the luteal phase. And back here, you can see the endometrium is ready for that ovum, and then if it's fertilized, for the embryo, and it continues to build itself up until the end of the cycle, when this corpus luteum degenerates and no longer makes estrogen or progesterone, and that's the signal for this endometrial layer to degenerate. And then we would start a whole new cycle all over again. So ovulation is when the LH levels surge, and those are coming from the anterior pituitary gland, and this will cause ovulation. The ovarian wall ruptures and the ovum is released. You can see in this picture that it's actually rupturing through the ovary wall. The ovum travels down the uterine tubes into the uterus. So as we know, the fimbriae picked up the ovum, and it's traveled down the uterine tubes with cilia and peristalsis. And the ovum lives only about 12 to 24 hours. So progesterone sustains the endometrial lining, and if you remember, the progesterone is coming from the follicle, now the corpus luteum, in the ovary. Progesterone affects quite a few things. It affects temperature. So right after ovulation, there's actually a small spike in a female's body temperature, about 1/10 or 2/10 of a degree. It affects cervical fluid and cervical position. Right around ovulation, a woman's cervical fluid and cervical position change, getting ready to make fertilization optimal, to optimize fertilization. So let's talk about what's going on with all the players. And you have this on a worksheet, and you may want to get that out. So in the brain, there are two hormones that are given off, FSH and LH. And then this is what's going on in the ovaries. These are the hormones given off by the ovaries. And then this is what's going on in the uterus. So again, in the ovary, we have the follicular phase, and that is the follicle is developing inside the ovary. And then back in the uterus, we know that the endometrial layer was sloughed off during menses or menstruation and then started building back up again. And then when we get this surge of LH from the brain, that triggers ovulation. And we know that the ovum then travels down the uterine tubes into the ovary, where it hangs out and is either fertilized and implants, or it hangs out until the end of the cycle and then it is sloughed off with the endometrial layer as menstrual fluid. So then back in the ovary, the follicle is now the corpus luteum, and it is giving off progesterone and some estrogen. And then as it degenerates, the progesterone levels tank, they go down quite a bit, and that is the signal for the uterus, for the endometrial layer to start to degenerate, and then that begins the beginning of another cycle. Okay, we're going to go through this again, and it's going to be color-coded as to what's going on where, and you have this on a worksheet, so you'll want to follow along with that. So F of Philope stands for FSH, which is a hormone. So FSH stimulates the follicle around the ovum in the ovary to develop. So that green is what's going on in the ovary. And then meanwhile, during this time, the endometrium layer sheds during the menstrual phase in the uterus. Yellow is what's going on in the uterus. So the developing follicle in the ovary produces the hormone estrogen, and that's our E letter. And then the estrogen that is produced by the follicle, estrogen, the hormone, tells the uterus to build the endometrium layer back up during the proliferative phase. So that's what's going on in the uterus. And then L, when the estrogen levels are high enough, it stimulates the release of a whole bunch of LH, called an LH surge, and that is our L phase happening. And then O, this LH surge, causes ovulation or release of the ovum from the ovary. And then the follicle that was left behind in the ovary, we now call the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum produces progesterone, and that is our P of Philope. And talking about the uterus, the ovum travels to the uterus where it was either fertilized and implants or it disintegrates. And the endometrial layer continues to develop in the uterus during the secretory phase. And then back in the ovaries, the corpus luteum, which we remember is the old follicle, disintegrates if there is no pregnancy and the progesterone levels drop. So this is what's going on in the ovaries, and then this is hormone. So the lack of progesterone causes the endometrial tissue to degenerate and the menstruation starts. So here's our hormone progesterone, and then this is what's going on in the uterus. Okay, in our next video, we're going to talk about if the ovum was fertilized, about conception, and then disorders. What could possibly go wrong with the human reproductive system? I will see you then.